The man in the back row had my hands. I noticed them first because he was holding a program the same way I did, thumb pressed against the fold, fingers spread wide. Then I saw his jaw, the particular way it set when he wasn't speaking. The minister was finishing the eulogy for Sarah, and I was supposed to be listening, but my attention had caught on this stranger like cloth on a nail. He sat perfectly still. He didn't cry. Neither did I, usually. But the resemblance made my chest tight in a way grief hadn't managed. When people began to stand and file toward the reception hall, he stayed seated. I shook hands and accepted condolences, but I kept him in my peripheral vision. He wore a dark suit, older cut, good fabric. His hair was trimmed shorter than mine, but the same sandy color going gray at the temples. Our daughter Emily touched my elbow and asked if I was all right, and I said I was, which was a lie that had become reflex over the past week. She went to handle something with the caterer. The stranger rose and walked toward me. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that I could see his eyes were hazel, like mine, with the same small scar through the left eyebrow from some childhood accident. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a photograph. He didn't say anything, just held it out between us. I took it because that's what you do when someone offers you something at a funeral. It was Sarah, much younger, maybe 23 or 24. She was standing on a boardwalk somewhere coastal, wind pulling her dark hair across her face. She was smiling at whoever held the camera. I had never seen this photograph. Sarah and I met when she was 29. Clearwater, he said. His voice had my cadence. Spring of 1998. I met Sarah in the fall of 2003. He turned and walked through the side door before I could form a question. I folded the photograph and put it in my pocket, and then I went to talk to my sister about why the coffee was running low, because that's what you do when your wife is dead, and someone who looks exactly like you hands you proof that she had a life you didn't know about. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the photograph under the lamp. Sarah's face was the same, younger, but unmistakable. The boardwalk behind her had a sign I could barely read. I got my reading glasses and a magnifying glass from the desk drawer. The sign said something about pier fishing, and below that, in smaller letters, a permit number. The kind of detail you don't notice unless you're looking for it. I had been a journalist for 23 years, most of it investigative work for a regional paper before the layoffs. Afterward, I'd gone freelance, chasing stories about municipal corruption and environmental violations, the kind of work that paid poorly but let me sleep. Sarah used to joke that I had a constitutional inability to let questions sit unanswered. She said it with affection, mostly. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about his hands, the way he moved, the scar. I thought about how Sarah had always been private about her early 20s, said it was just a time she wanted to leave behind. I'd assumed it was the usual reasons, bad relationships, uncertain years. Everyone has a chapter they'd rather skip when telling their story. At dawn I made coffee and started searching. Clearwater, Florida, 1998. I pulled property records, business licenses, anything that might connect. Sarah's maiden name was Connolly. I found 3 S. Connollys in the Clearwater area during that window. One was 60 years old, one was male. The third was listed at an address on Gulf Boulevard for 11 months, starting in January 1998. I called a friend who still worked at the paper, asked him to pull archived phone directories. It took him 2 days. The listing came back with a landline that no longer existed, but the address matched. Sarah had lived there. She'd never mentioned Florida at all. Emily called that afternoon to check on me. I told her I was sorting through paperwork, which was true in a sense. She said she'd come by on the weekend with groceries. I told her not to worry, that I was managing. She said that's what concerned her. After we hung up, I sat with the photograph again. Something about it itched at me beyond the obvious questions. I looked at the angle, the way the light fell. Whoever took this picture knew her well enough to make her smile like that. The smile wasn't posed. It was the kind she used to give me when I said something unexpectedly sweet. I found a message board for Clearwater residents and posted the pier image, asked if anyone recognized the location. Within 4 hours, someone replied with coordinates and a name, Pier 60. A local landmark, busy, the kind of place you'd take someone to show them the area. I booked a flight for the next morning. The motel outside Clearwater smelled like bleach and sea air. I rented a car and drove to the address on Gulf Boulevard. The building was still there, a low-rise apartment complex with pink stucco and palm trees that had grown thick in the decades since. The manager was a woman in her 50s who said she'd only been there 8 years. I showed her Sarah's photo and asked if she knew who might have records from 1998. She made a call. An hour later, I was sitting across from the previous owner, a man named Voss who'd retired but kept boxes of old leases in his garage because, he said, you never know when you might need them for tax purposes. He found Sarah's file. The lease was under her name, co-signed by a man named Thomas Driscoll. I asked if he remembered them. He said young couples came and went, but he remembered those two because they'd paid 6 months up front in cash, which wasn't common. He said they were polite, quiet, stayed mostly to themselves. I asked if he had a forwarding address. He didn't. I asked if he remembered when they left. He checked the file. November 1998. No. Explanation, just a note that they'd cleared out and left the place clean. Thomas Driscoll. I called in another favor, this time with a researcher who specialized in background checks. She called back that evening. Thomas Driscoll, born in 1977, same year as me. Last known address in Clearwater, 1998. After that, nothing. No credit cards, no tax filings, no driver's license renewals. He'd vanished from every database she could access. I drove to Pier 60 and stood where Sarah had stood in the photograph. The tourists moved around me, kids with ice cream, couples holding hands. I tried to picture her here, younger, with a man who had my face. The logic didn't work. The timeline didn't work. But the photograph was real, and the man at the funeral was real, and Sarah was gone, which meant I couldn't ask her. That's when I noticed the research facility. It sat 3 blocks inland, a clean modern building with tinted windows and a small sign. Helix Biomedical Solutions. I'd walked past it twice without registering it. Now I stopped and looked. The building was maybe 4 stories, the kind of place that could be anything from a tech startup to a dental practice. But something about it pulled at me. I went back to the motel and searched. Helix Biomedical Solutions had been founded in 1994, focused on genetic research and fertility services. They'd operated in Clearwater until 2005, when they'd relocated to a larger facility in North Carolina. The company had been involved in several lawsuits over the years, mostly settled quietly, the kind of legal noise that suggested money and lawyers. One case stood out, a wrongful termination suit filed by a lab technician in 2001, claiming she'd been fired for raising ethical concerns about patient consent protocols. The case had been settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement. The technician's name was Liu. I found her on a professional networking site. She was working at a hospital in Atlanta now. I sent her a message, explained I was a journalist following up on some questions about Helix. She didn't respond. I tried a different approach. I called the hospital, said I was a colleague who'd worked with her years ago, asked if there was a good time to reach her. The receptionist said Dr. Liu was usually available after rounds, around 4. I called at 4:15. When she answered, I told her the truth. I said my wife had died, and a man who looked exactly like me had appeared at her funeral with a photograph that didn't make sense, and the only thread I had led back to Clearwater in 1998 and a company where she used to work. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Are you somewhere you can talk privately?" I said I was. She said, "Helix ran a program in the 90s. Officially, it was about fertility assistance, helping couples conceive through genetic matching. Unofficially, they were doing something else. I was low level then, just processing samples, but I saw things that didn't fit. Consent forms that didn't match procedures. Samples taken from donors who thought they were part of a simple genetic study, but then those samples would go to a different lab, one we weren't supposed to access." I asked what kind of procedures. She said, "I think they were creating genetic duplicates, not clones in the science fiction sense, but something close. Taking genetic material and using surrogates to produce children who were essentially twins to existing people. I don't know why. I raised concerns and got buried in legal threats. They paid me to go away and never talk about it. I asked why she was talking now. She said, because if what you're describing is real, it means I was right, and someone needs to know." I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat very still and thought about my hands, and Thomas Driscoll's hands, and how genetics worked. The next morning I drove back to the apartment building. I talked to neighbors, people who'd lived there since the 90s. Most didn't remember Sarah or Thomas. One woman, older, said she'd lived in the unit above theirs. She remembered them as a nice couple, very young, very private. She said the girl had been pregnant when they left. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I asked if she knew where they went. She said no, but she remembered the girl crying a lot those last few weeks, and the man trying to comfort her. She said it had seemed like they were scared of something. I flew home and went through every box of Sarah's belongings I'd kept: photo albums, old journals, tax returns. I found a hospital bill from 1999, a small balance for a consultation she'd paid in cash. The hospital was in North Carolina. I called and navigated the bureaucracy until I reached medical records. I explained I was Sarah's widower, trying to piece together her medical history. They said they'd need proof of death and a formal request. I sent everything they asked for. It took a week. The records came back sparse, but there was one note: consultation for adoption services, referral provided. Adoption services. I called Emily and asked if her mother had ever mentioned adoption. She said no. Why? I said I was just finding things in old papers, trying to understand the full picture. She asked if I was okay, said I was starting to sound obsessed. I told her I was fine. I wasn't fine. I started mapping it. Sarah in Clearwater with Thomas Driscoll in 1998, pregnant by November, North Carolina consultation in 1999. Then nothing until 2003, when I met her at a conference in Baltimore. She'd been working in nonprofit administration, smart and careful, and carrying herself like someone who'd survived something she didn't want to discuss. I'd fallen in love with her precision, the way she listened before speaking, the way she built walls but let me see the doors. We married in 2004. Emily was born in 2006. Sarah had been a devoted mother, meticulous about routines, fiercely protective. She'd never wanted to talk about her past. I'd respected that. Now I wondered what I'd been respecting. I hired a private investigator, someone I'd worked with on stories before. I gave him everything: the photograph, Thomas Driscoll's name, the Helix connection, the North Carolina hospital. I told him I needed to know what happened in the missing years. He called 2 weeks later. He'd found a birth record. Sarah Connolly had given birth to a son in March 1999 at a hospital in Raleigh. The child had been placed for adoption through a private agency that had since closed. The adoption records were sealed. I asked if there was any way to unseal them. He said, "Not legally, not without cause." I said, "Find a cause." He called back 3 days later. The agency had been sued in 2007 by adoptive parents who claimed they'd been misled about the child's genetic background. The case files were public record. He'd pulled them. The child's name was Michael Driscoll. He'd been adopted by a family in Virginia. The lawsuit had been settled. The family compensated for undisclosed genetic anomalies that had appeared later. I asked what kind of anomalies. He said the records weren't specific, but the medical documentation referenced genetic duplication markers, the kind of thing that shouldn't occur naturally. I sat with that for a long time. Then I started looking for Michael Driscoll. He was 26 now, living in Richmond, working as a database engineer. I found his contact information through professional directories. I didn't call, I drove. Richmond was 4 hours south. I arrived in the afternoon and parked outside the apartment building listed in his last known address. I waited. At 6:30, a young man came out. He had Sarah's dark hair, her build. He had my walk. I got out of the car and called his name. He turned. His face was mine, younger, unlined, but the same structure, the same angles. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I was wondering when you'd find me." We sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks away. Michael didn't drink his coffee, just turned the cup in his hands. I asked how long he'd known. He said, "Since I was 16. My adoptive parents told me after the lawsuit. They said there'd been some kind of genetic experiment in the 90s, that I was part of it. They said they didn't know the details, just that I wasn't supposed to exist the way I did." I asked if he knew about Sarah. He said, I found her a few years ago. I didn't contact her. I just wanted to see her once, to know where I came from. I saw she had a daughter, a normal life. I didn't want to disrupt that. I asked about Thomas Driscoll. He said, "That was supposed to be you." I waited. He said, "From what I've been able to piece together, Helix was running a program to create genetic duplicates of people. They'd find donors, take samples without full consent, and produce children through surrogates. They'd match these children with partners who had similar genetics to the original donors. The idea was to see if genetics or environment determined life outcomes. You were one of the donors. So was Sarah. They made Thomas Driscoll from your genetics, put him together with Sarah, created me. Then something went wrong. The program got exposed, or nearly exposed. They shut it down, erased the connections. Thomas disappeared, Sarah disappeared. But you were still out there, living your life, unaware." I asked how he knew this. He said, "Because Thomas came to see me last year. He's been looking for answers too. He gave me access to documents he'd stolen when the program collapsed. It's all there. Donor lists, surrogate contracts, genetic profiles. You and Sarah were part of it. So was I." I asked where Thomas was now. He said, "I don't know. He moves around. He's careful. He said there are others, more duplicates, more stolen lives. He said someone needs to make Helix answer for it." I asked why he came to Sarah's funeral. Michael said, "I didn't. That was Thomas. He wanted you to know. He wanted you to start asking questions." I finished my coffee. It was cold. I asked if Michael had copies of the documents. He said he did. I asked if he'd be willing to go public with this. He said, "Are you?" I thought about Sarah, about how she'd carried this secret, about how she'd built a life with me knowing I was a mirror of someone else. I thought about Emily, who deserved to know the truth. I thought about all the other people who might be walking around with duplicates they didn't know about, lives designed by someone else's experiment. I said yes. We spent the next 3 months building the case. Michael provided the documents. I reached out to Dr. Liu, convinced her to go on record. The private investigator tracked down 3 other families who'd been part of the program, people who'd given genetic samples for what they thought was a fertility study, and later discovered children who looked exactly like them being raised by strangers. One of them was a lawyer. She took the case pro bono. Helix had changed names twice since the 90s, but the parent company still existed. We filed a lawsuit in federal court alleging genetic theft, fraud, and violation of informed consent. The media picked it up. Other victims came forward. Within 6 weeks, we had 17 confirmed cases of genetic duplication, children who'd been created without donor knowledge, families who'd been manipulated into relationships with duplicates. The company settled in November. They paid damages, admitted no wrongdoing, but agreed to release all program records and submit to independent oversight. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was acknowledgement. The records went public. Hundreds of people discovered they'd been part of the program, either as donors or as duplicates. Support networks formed, families reconnected, or chose not to. The world adjusted. I found Thomas in December. He was living in Oregon under a different name, working construction. I flew out and met him at a diner near the coast. He looked older than me, worn down by years of hiding. We sat across from each other and didn't speak for a while. Finally, he said Sarah had loved us both, in different ways, and that she'd spent her whole life trying to build something real out of something that had been designed for her. I asked if he'd loved her. He said, "I don't know if I was made to love her or if I chose it. Does it matter?" I didn't have an answer. We parted on good terms, or as good as they could be given everything. He said he was glad I'd found the truth. I said I was sorry he'd had to carry it alone. Emily took the news hard. She asked questions I couldn't answer about identity and genetics and whether any of our family was real. I told her love was real, that the years we'd had with Sarah were real, that choice mattered more than design. She didn't believe me at first. It took time. We're still working through it. I think about Sarah often. I think about how she must have felt, pregnant at 24 with a child created from a program she didn't fully understand, partnered with a man who was a genetic copy of someone else. I think about how she chose to walk away, to give up her son, to build a new life far from the experiment. I think about how she chose me, the original, maybe because I represented something uncontrolled, something that wasn't part of anyone's design. I'll never know for certain. But I have the photographs now, all of them. Sarah in Clearwater, young and scared. Sarah at our wedding, smiling with relief. Sarah holding Emily, finally at peace. Different chapters, different versions, all real. The man at the funeral looked just like me because he was made to, but I'm the one she chose to stay with. And that, I've decided, is enough.